All right. Decent weekend. Right. 3 weeks down. 3 weeks down. We've got a lab. Lab this week, bring a calculator. Calculator, preferably pencil. You're going to learn how to use Hardy-Weinberg equations to determine if a population is evolving. All right, so it is, of the different maths that we do, this one is one that is mostly math. All right, you'll learn the equations, and then we have a simulation. It kind of should demonstrate some of the principles. Just got to remember that random chance can come back and bite us when we do this. So make sure you kind of read through, have an idea of what we're doing. You don't need to understand how we're doing the simulation. We'll go over that in lab. Plan to be there for the 3 hours. Plan to be there for the 3 hours. All right. This is where we left off. All right, inactivity. So these are avoidance strategies. Organism finds itself in a region, maybe they're in their stress zone, or they're in an area where they can't survive. What can they do? One thing is avoid it. All right, and that's what we're talking about right now. All right, the options to avoid these harsh conditions. Inactivity is one of the ways that we can avoid it. Now, with the inactivity, we talked about developmental arrest, diapause. A lot of plants utilize this by creating their seeds, and then seeds sit out in the environment over winter. All right, that's a harsh environment for them. They wait for a signal that says environment's improving, and then they start growing again. All right, they germinate and they start growing when the conditions improve. Insect larvae and pupa, just kind of depends on what stage they're at, which stage would incorporate it. But this is also a type of inactivity. They develop up to a point and then they stop, and they can overwinter. Once conditions improve, they become active. The other type of inactivity is torpor. So this is where we left off. This is a state of decreased physiological function. All right, we are slowing down our metabolic rates, slowing down energy consumption. All right, a lot of times we're decreasing our body temperature, core temperature. We don't really do this, but other animals that would, they basically slow themselves way down to try to conserve energy during that time. Because oftentimes during these harsh conditions, energy is low. All right, it's going to be hard for them to acquire energy. So if they can save it and can do what they can to conserve energy, they're hoping that they can survive until the times improve. All right, the types of torpor that you may have heard about is hibernation and estivation. All right, so torpor is just our generic term. That's our generic term. Hibernation would be the winter torpor, so torpor over winter. Estivation would be torpor over summer. And I put these in quotation marks, winter torpor and summer torpor, just to kind of help define the time periods on when the terms are typically used anyways. All right, so hibernation, this is an extended type of torpor, extended form of torpor. Often it's during the winter, hence our winter torpor. And if organisms choose this route, then they could be either obligate hibernators or facultative hibernators. And the difference is obligate versus facultative is basically, is it required or not? All right, do they have to enter hibernation every year, or do they only undergo hibernation when the conditions actually become bad? All right, so our obligate hibernator are those that must hibernate seasonally. They will always do it. All right, it's programmed in their code, genetic code, to undergo hibernation every year. All right, an example of this are the ground squirrels. They're obligate hibernators. They will always just go down into their burrow, enter this form of torpor, this hibernation, where they really slow down their metabolic rates, slow down their heart rates, lower their temperatures, all just to conserve energy. Our facultative hibernators are those that they don't need to become torpid. All right, they don't have to do it seasonally, but they will when the conditions are really bad. All right. The benefit of these facultative hibernators is that they get to slow down their metabolic rates. They get to conserve their energy, but they can quickly come out of hibernation if the conditions actually improve a little bit. So you kind of have it, I don't want to say the best of both worlds, you know, because there's sometimes just conserving energy is a good thing to do. But they're conserving energy, but if conditions aren't terribly bad, they can still be active, they can still forage, they can still, you know, do whatever else they need to do. An example of these facultative hibernators, bears. Bears are one. Bats are another one. Bats can go down for a couple days at a time. Then they rouse when the conditions improve a little bit. Up in my area, raccoons could do that. Like in incredibly cold periods, yeah, they're down. They hibernate in their den for a couple days. When weather warms up a little bit, they become active. Estivation is basically the same thing, except it's over the summer. All right. So for the winter, we're avoiding the cold, we're avoiding the freeze, we're avoiding the limited energy that's available. You know, if you think about nothing's really growing over the winter. Over the summer, it's about avoiding the heat and the water stress. It's really what it's about. Now we call it, you know, as part of the definition, it's torpor or possibly hibernation during the summer. Again, torpor's, you know, the general term, and whether or not the estivation or hibernation are exactly the same thing, we can debate it. We can debate it. But they do slow down their metabolic rates to try to conserve their energy. All right. Questions? All right. Before I move on, attendance answer today, 5. You got choice of 4 numbers. One of them's 5. All right. Why become inactive? It really addresses 2 problems, and I mentioned these things. I've already mentioned the 2 problems. One, it's the harsh conditions themselves. The environmental conditions changed, you know, and they could have changed to put our organism outside of our tolerance zone. So now our organism's in that zone of intolerance. All right. So if they become inactive, they basically wait out that condition. They've shut themselves down, even though they're still in the intolerance zone. They've shut themselves down so they're not really experiencing those harsh environments, those harsh physical factors. The second problem that gets addressed is the energy limitation that is often accompanied by these harsh conditions. So I like using winter because it's kind of easy to imagine. You get a bunch of snow, that snow covers up the grass and the vegetation, and any herbivore is going to have a hard time finding their food. All right? Grass isn't available. It's underneath, let's say, a foot of snow or 2 feet of snow. The brush, you know, the browsers, you know, they might not see it. They might not get to it. The trees have dropped their leaves. All right, they're not growing. It's going to be hard for these organisms to acquire their energy. All right, so we've got these 2 problems that we're trying to address. Inactivity can do this. All right, benefit that, yeah, hopefully we can survive the harsh conditions. And that is both physically, so trying to avoid the freeze, try to avoid the water stress, but also energetically. Because if they're inactive, they're not going to have to go out and pursue food or find food, find water, and so forth. The other benefit of inactivity is related to predator avoidance. If you are in a hole, in a burrow, you are not exposing yourself to the predators. So not only are you avoiding the harsh conditions themselves and the energy limitation that comes with that, but you're also being less exposed to predators. So it's kind of like a side effect. And if you're less exposed to predators, you're going to have a higher survival rate. And that's what this graph is showing you. So we've got bats on here, we have other mammals. Basically, if you're hibernators, which would be the orange line, the top lines, they've got higher survival relative to the same type of organism that is not a hibernator. All right. Did you get it? So inactivity is one approach to avoid the harsh conditions. Movement is the other approach. And I'm sure if I mention avoidance and said, okay, how do organisms avoid the harsh conditions? You are probably already thinking, well, they'll just move, right? We'll change locations. And that is a strategy that is picked by a lot of organisms. All right. Now, our avoidance strategy could be either a local move. All right. This is, we walk outside barefoot, we hit the concrete's hot, we quickly move ourselves to an area that doesn't burn our feet. That's a local move. All right. Organism, we sensed our environment, it's uncomfortable, it's bad for us, we move just immediately to a new area. But we also have long distance movements. All right, this would be, migration patterns, basically, where we undergo a regular movement every year in anticipation of the harsh conditions. All right, so we're going to talk about migration. And migration is defined as a seasonal movement from one region to another and back. All right, on this map, these are the flyways. These are waterfowl flyways, grouped by color so you can see them. But these were all birds that were tagged or banded, and where they were recovered. So you can see waterfowl undergo fairly large patterns. Migration. You've got some that summer up in northern Alaska, and then they overwinter down southern coast of Texas. That's a pretty big migration pattern. Now, with our migrators, just like our hibernators, it could be obligate migrators or facultative migrators. So, I'm going to use waterfowl again. We do have local populations of waterfowl here. They don't migrate. They just stay here year round. Okay. Others will always migrate no matter what. They're always going to undergo that migration. So why migrate? Well, again, we have to think back to the harsh conditions and the benefit of moving, the advantage of moving. So when is it advantageous to develop migration? Well, one is if our harsh conditions are predictable. All right, and I put seasonal here because it's going to happen every year. Since it's happening every year, our organism could develop develop sensory mechanisms that tells them, hey, seasons are changing, our winter is approaching, time to start moving. So as long as it's predictable and it happens every year, migration could be advantageous. And we also need those signals. All right, we need those signals because the organism has to prep for that move, for that migration. All right, this isn't a very easy task for our organism. All right, we're traveling a very long distance. All right, and there are risks associated with that. What are some of the risks? What do you think? What's that? Predation. Why predation? Why is that a risk? Yeah, okay, so we're putting ourselves out there. You're more exposed. In your area where you are, we're going to use ducks, all right? You're up in the summer grounds, breeding grounds, all right? You have one set of predators there. As you move, you're going to be exposed to different sets of predators. And in a lot of cases, more predators, all right? What's probably number one predator of these waterfowl that are migrating? Take you guys. Really? What's that? People. You waterfowl hunt? You do. See? You do. You put a band on one of these birds, and the hunters see the band, that's a death sentence. That's target number one. They want those bands. So yeah, we might not be a normal predator over the wintering grounds, but once they start migrating, now humans become their predators. And humans use it for both recreation and for food. Other risks, so that's a higher risk of mortality, and that's due to predation. And there's other factors that you have to contend with, including the stress. The stress of this long migration might make the individual more susceptible to disease, more susceptible to viruses and bacterial infections and so forth. You also have the unpredictability of the weather. Yeah, winter's coming, you start flying, but they don't know if a massive winter blizzard storm is popping up. They don't know that. So they're going to be more exposed to these types of situations, increasing the risk of mortality. Now, we said this is a very long and hard trip, and it requires large amount of energy. Large amount of energy. And this is where the signals and the cues of the oncoming winter are appropriate. Because once they get the cues, the birds start stocking up on their energy reserves, they start building muscles, start storing energy, all in preparation for this move, and then along the way, they stop and they have to refuel. By the time they get down to their wintering grounds, they are pretty thin. They are pretty thin. So this is actually pretty big cost, pretty big risks to undertake the migration. And this goes back to now our trade-offs. With all of these risks, increased mortality, energy reserves, and all this stuff, why have it? Well, the benefits must have exceeded these costs. The benefits must have exceeded the risks. And it's the benefits of avoiding the harsh conditions, avoiding the energy limitation that is associated with the winter. Right? Those benefits well exceeded the costs associated with taking that migration. All right? So our migration and hibernation are all about these large-scale, long-term, harsh conditions. And that's why I said, like winter. Winter comes on. It's going to persist for a couple months. Right? This occurs over a large spatial scale, too. These are the avoidance strategies to deal with that. What happens if it's a short term, or if it's a very localized type of harsh conditions? Well, you're not going to see migration develop. You're not really going to see torpor develop or hibernation develop because it's only very short term. So, How do they adjust? Well, moving is probably the easiest way. Just move to a more favorable area. I put this up here, behavioral thermal regulation. Now, we haven't talked about regulating our temperature yet, but with it, this is behavioral form of regulating a body temperature. So as we're going to learn, maybe today, when we talk about thermal regulation, regulating our internal temperature, it's all about a physiological mechanism. All right? Our bodies will generate more heat when we're cold, or it'll try to dump excess heat if we're too hot. All right? That's a physiological mechanism. Some of these organisms, like these lizards, they're not regulating their temperature through a physiological mechanism. They're doing it behaviorally. So with this behavioral thermal regulation, what they're going to do is change where they are in the environment. All right? Are they exposed more to sun? Do they go more into the shade? Do they orient themselves so that most of their body is getting the direct rays of the sun, or do they do it to minimize how many rays actually hit them, the intensity, you could say? All right, so with our behavioral thermal regulation, it's not necessarily, it's not a physiological mechanism, it's behavioral. And this, I think, is a pretty good example to show how an organism can move on the short term, all right, over a small scale when conditions improve or become less favorable, either one. So our example are these basking lizards. You see it all the time. You might see it out around campus. Maintenance will go, or the groundskeepers will go out and water some of the trees. All right, they'll soak the ground. The ground is cooler, and occasionally you will go out and you will see a squirrel that is just laid out, sprawled out on the ground. They're increasing their surface area with that ground. That's a movement pattern. They sense a cooler environment. They're trying to avoid the extreme heat that we have over the summer, and they're finding a cooler spot. It's all movement. Another way in which our organisms can adjust to our environment is just to change activity levels. And that's what this graph is showing you. All right? You've got your lizards. This is also lizards, believe it or not. Lizards go out there, they start warming up, and they're basically active. They're out moving around. moving around. But as soon as the clouds come in, now activity of these lizards start to slow down. All right? They start, it starts cooling off. When the clouds go over, they start basking again to try to get their body temperature up. And their body temperature needs to be up so that they can forage. So they kind of change when they're active, during what parts of the day they're active, based on these environmental conditions. We see it out here in West Texas, right? A lot of organisms, they don't become active until the evening. All right, why? It's cooler. It's cooler out there. They don't have the sun's rays. They don't have all of the heat. All right, that's a form of avoidance of our harsh condition. Questions? All right, leave that up. All right, so this wraps up our avoidance. Again, not terrible. Probably was somewhat intuitive on this form of adaptation to a harsh environment. What we are going to move to is physiological adaptations. What's that? Yes. Just had a question. Are we going to have a quiz on avoidance? Yes. I will release the quiz. You'll have until Wednesday night, 11:30. Again, you can get 3 attempts. That one's a bit more on some definitions. Again, cost benefits of these types of strategies. And if you just, again, remember that if an adaptation evolves and having the ability to enter hibernation, that's an adaptation. Having the ability to migrate, that's an adaptation. In order for those to evolve and persist, the benefits have to exceed the cost. All right. So, physiological adaptations. We're gonna break this up. We'll do thermal stress and we'll do water stress after. All right, and with the water stress, we'll split it up between the animals and plants because we've got different things to talk about. All right, so when dealing with physiological adaptation, we have two categories of responses. All right, we've got a shift in our tolerance limits. All right, so now we're talking evolution, that our tolerance limits match what you would encounter in a changing climate. You're allowing your body to basically tolerate those new conditions. And hopefully you're tolerating a wide range, the range that you're most likely to encounter. The other broad category isn't really shifting your tolerance limits, but rather maintaining your internal environmental conditions. So it matters less what's happening around us and more about maintaining a constant condition in our body. All right, this is homeostasis. That's what we're talking about. All right, and that's kind of what this graph is saying. We've got external conditions. You've got a range of external conditions. All right, if we're going to have this internal regulation, our internal conditions should stay in narrow range, in narrow bounds, across that range of across the range of external environmental conditions. Ready for this? So our tolerance limits can change either in location or in spread. All right? And we can change in our location or spread. Go back? All right, yeah, no problem. Good? All right, so for explaining this concept, let's assume we have two populations, population A and population B. All right? If we have a difference in location, and these that represent our tolerance limits, our zone of tolerance, and our axis here represents the the external conditions, external environmental conditions. Population A may have tolerance limits up here. Population B may have tolerance limits down here. And I did this specifically because a population is a group of individuals of the same species. All right, so this isn't two different species. This is the same species, just two different populations. And our populations adapted to the conditions that they are normally exposed to. So population A tolerates lower conditions. Population B tolerates higher conditions. If we were to take individuals and transplant them, do a transfer and move them over to the other location, they're probably not going to do too well because they're outside of their tolerance zones. So that's changing our zones based on location. And this could be, through any process of selection. Process of selection can produce this. Spread is that how wide of our zones do we have? All right, so population A has narrow tolerance zone, population B has a wide tolerance zone. Again, same species, just two different populations. Now, what does the spread tell us? What could inform us about that environment? Well, perhaps population B experiences much more variable environment, much wider range of environmental conditions, and that's why its tolerance zones are that wide, are so wide. Perhaps population A lives in an area where the conditions are fairly constant, unchanging. That helps explain why they have such a narrow tolerance. And we can come up with examples, different habitats that exhibit these types of conditions. But no matter what we see in our populations, we know that these tolerance limits are going to be shaped by natural selection. All right? They're going to be shaped by natural selection. So it's not just the range of environmental conditions that they're exposed to, but also the variability. Do they change a lot? Do they change quickly? Are those changes predictable? Are they unpredictable? And so forth. But it's not all about nature. Right? It's not all about natural selection. Because sometimes these limits will be shaped by the prior exposure. So what were the conditions that the organism was developing, growing up in? All right? That condition, the environmental effect, could also shape our tolerance levels. Acclimation is one such example. Acclimation is defined as an individual's physiological adjustment to challenging abiotic conditions. So as the individual is able to adjust. Can humans acclimate? Oh yeah. Yeah, we do. Some of you have it. Your watch. Actually, all of us do. Any clothes, right? You acclimate to it that you don't even realize you're wearing some of the stuff. You know, eyeglasses. First time you put them on, you notice. You notice, yeah, I've got my glasses on. But eventually, you forget about it. That's habituation, but it's acclimation if we're talking about environmental conditions. All right, this works when we have slow changes in the environment. Right? This works when we have slow changes in the environment that allows the organism to actually adjust. This type of response is actually favored when species and populations live in variable environments. Those environments that will fluctuate and change. And change somewhat, they change in a way that allows the organism to adjust. River species, aquatic species, all right? That environment changes. You get a big rain, you get a high flow, that clears out a lot of the conditions of the water. And then when the flow returns to normal, then our conditions change. You know, you get down to the mouth of the rivers, you know, where they enter the ocean. Right? You have changing salinities, and that could change based on flow. You know, how far out the salinity changes on in that river. If you take limnology with Dr. Strength, you'll learn about that. All right. So key point here, I put it in a big gray box here. Tolerance limits are not rigid. They can change. They can change either through selection or, in some cases, the individual can acclimate and cause their tolerance limits to change. All right. So with that background information, keep this in mind as we move and talk about the thermal environment, heat. All right, you ready? Temperature is pretty important. It can have a lot of effects on our organisms. All right. Main ones are these three that I listed up here. Temperature affects our rates of the reaction. It can affect our membrane permeability, And high heat can denature proteins and DNA. These are pretty big problems. All right, so we're going to start with the reaction rates. If you remember from chemistry, I think you've all had chemistry, we talk about rates of reactions using Q10s, right? Rate for a change in rate for a 10-degree change in temperature, right? I'm not going to ask you what's a Q10 at all. Just know that the reaction rate. So our metabolic processes are just a series of pathways. All right, and I try to make a simple pathway, A to B to C to D, and we've got, let's say, enzymes that catalyze these changes from A all the way through D. All right, those enzymes can have different Q10s, different rates based on the temperature. So we could have a situation where temperature goes down and we can't keep up. We need D to live and to survive, but because the temperature went down, because our rate slowed, we can't get to D. It's too slow. We are consuming more than we are producing. That's a bad thing. High temperatures could do the same thing, where temperatures increase. Let's say two of these pathways really sped up and can keep up with demand, but we have one, let's say this B to C, that just relatively indifferent to temperature, and thus it can't keep up. So you can have a buildup of, let's say, B, and if that's toxic, that's a bad thing. Or we just don't have enough D to survive again. All right, so temperature can affect our rates of the reaction. That's why, for us, regulating our temperature is actually a pretty good thing because it keeps our rates fairly constant. There's exceptions when we get an infection, right? Our body temperature increases, all aimed at increasing our ability to fight these foreign invaders. Membrane permeability is the other effect, or second effect. All right, so if you increase your temperatures, you tend to make the membrane more fluid. That's going to change your diffusion rates. It's going to change your osmosis rates. In some cases, it can affect the membrane integrity. All right, and all of these things, again, if we're relying on diffusion and osmosis for our cells, and these things change, that our cells can't get the water or can't get the glucose that it needs, cells will starve and die. And our third effect is denaturing proteins and DNAs. And we do have, even with our membrane permeabilities, we have some things that the organism can do to adapt to higher temperatures, lower temperatures, and so forth. But for denaturing, we have some proteins that have developed and have evolved as a way to protect against the denaturing caused by heat. All right, so we have heat shock proteins, Hsps. These are small proteins that stabilize the three-dimensional structure of large proteins to maintain their function at high temperatures. So let's say at 140 degrees. Actually, no, we'll go lower. At 120 degrees, that denatures our proteins. You denature that protein, you break down the three-dimensional shape, that protein loses its function. So these heat shock proteins kind of integrate inside of that protein structure, that three-dimensional structure, and help to hold it in the correct shape. So at 120, 125, 130 degrees, our organism can function and still survive. You see these a lot in what are called the thermophiles, the high heat loving organisms, deep sea vents. Here, deep sea thermal vents, hot springs, all right? That's hot. You see these heat shock proteins in those types of organisms. And those aren't the only ones that have them, but they represent a pretty good example because these organisms are living in hot environments. We also have cold acclimation proteins. These are caps. All right? They help to protect DNA and RNA at our lower temperatures. And you can say, well, hold on. At lower temperatures, we don't denature our proteins. We don't denature our DNA. I'd say, yeah, that is 100% true. We don't do that. But at these lower temperatures, we have the risk of freezing. And when the water molecules freeze and form crystals, you can get those crystals breaking your DNA. And if you break the DNA, well, yeah, you can't replicate. All right, you've got problems. So that's what these cold acclimation proteins will do. They integrate into the DNA, into the RNAs, to try to protect them from being sheared when the organism freezes. And again, it's cold temperatures. More than likely, the organisms will allow themselves to freeze. And they just protect themselves so that when they thaw, they're still functional. Some organisms, they might have had these heat shock proteins or cold acclimation proteins. They might also, they may have, I don't want to say they've changed, evolution may have selected for a higher concentration of GC pairs, guanine cytosine pairs. All right, these pairs, triple bond, they take more energy to break them. All right, so in their genetic code, they have more of these pairs, which help to stabilize their DNA structure. All right, we see this as well. Those of you interested in systematics and stuff, yeah, those GC pairs can pose a problem with trying to amplify and sequence an organism. Questions? So that is why it matters. All right, so we'll wrap this up. So we're talking about heat. Before we can talk about the adaptations, we have to understand how heat moves. Right? Our organisms will always gain heat or lose heat, just constant. Gaining or losing. How do they gain or lose heat? They lose it through these different mechanisms. So heat is just the thermal energy that can be transferred from one body to another. And you can say temperature kind of measures the heat a little bit. Right? We'll leave the temperature versus heat to the chemists and the philosophy of science. Sure. Right. Just know we're talking about heat. We're transferring that energy, that thermal energy. All right, so we can transfer it through conduction. Conduction is when you have two bodies that are in contact. All right, two bodies in contact. You will transfer heat from high heat to low heat. So whichever one's warmer will transfer heat from the warm to the cold. All right, conduction. That's transfer of heat between two bodies in contact. Convection is a transfer of heat from an object to a moving fluid or gas. Stepped in the wrong spot. All right, so just being out. Where is it? Right here. I feel the air moving through. I am losing heat through convection. All right? Bodies, I'm transferring heat to that fluid, to that moving air. Radiation. That's a transfer of heat between two bodies not in physical contact. So conduction, we're touching. I've got my space. I am transferring heat through radiation. Well, actually probably not, because my hands should be the same temperature. But if I go up to one of you, you know, sometimes you can feel the heat radiating off of things. That's radiation. You go to a stove, it's hot. Put your hand over the top, you can feel it. That's radiation. We're not in contact. Now, the amount of radiation that's absorbed or emitted is described based on their emissivity or absorptivity. So emissivity is the tendency of an object to absorb radiation, to emit radiation, and emissivity is emitting radiation, absorptivity is absorbing radiation. All right, so we can change that. We can change our absorptivity and emissivity. And then lastly, evaporative cooling. This is going to be the loss of heat through the vaporization of a fluid. Usually water. For us, it's going to be water. All right, but it doesn't have to be. Don't tell you, don't. Well, actually, no, we've got it. I was going to say, don't tell your chemistry professor who told you to do this, but you take some alcohol and you spray it on your hands and rub them up. All right, you feel cold. Right? It's a fluid, right? It's the liquid sanitizer with the alcohol-based sanitizer. You should also feel it as it dries out. It's sucking heat from your hand. Actually, our body heat's causing the evaporation of that alcohol that's in there. All right. Notice conduction, convection, radiation. These are all transfers. It's positive or negative. We could gain or we could lose heat, but evaporative cooling is always going to be a loss of heat. All right, we don't gain heat through this. This evaporative cooling costs energy. All right. Question is, why would it cost energy? I mean, one of our costs is water, for us anyways. But why would it also cost energy? Anything? Give it some thought. All right. I gave you the answer to the quiz at the start of class. Don't forget to take those. We will stop here. We will pick up the cost. Think about what the cost of this evaporative cooling is. Why does it cost energy? All right, and we'll start with that on Wednesday. All right. All right. Have a good one.